Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel for my first Surge tutorial. In this video I'm going to discuss how to make an analog-like pad using Surge, using its classic oscillators and its wonderful OBX emulation filter, which is very good sounding in my book, and it's an emulation of one of the filters which gave some of the most amazing pads from the 80s, and therefore is quite a suitable filter for doing a sound like that. Before getting on the video, I want to mention that I've checked out my YouTube analytics, and it seems like only 23% of my views come from subscribers. So if you are appreciating my content, I ask you, please do subscribe. It's gonna help out a lot. This said, let's get going. So here we are with Surge. It's not so friendly interface, and I'm gonna go around and look a little bit into what's what. Here we have a classic oscillator, which now is this sawtooth, which, as you might see from the graphics, and you might, if your ear is amazing, understand from your hearing, doesn't really look and sound like a proper sawtooth. This because this classic oscillator is intended to emulate the behavior of an analog circuitry. So, it would be something akin to the charge-discharge cycle of a condenser. If you want a purely mathematical sawtooth, you'll have to go for a modern oscillator. And in this case, it's like this, or the other way, it will be just an inversion in polarity. And that goes for all the shapes. Anyway, getting back to our classic oscillator, it has quite a bunch of parameters. Here up there you can change the octaves. Here you can control the pitch in cents or semitones and go from up or down by 7 semitones. Here you control the shape, which is quite an interesting parameter. It goes from being a square wave, which doesn't look like a square wave, but again, it is made so to sound a bit more like an analog square wave, and this other way it will turn into a double saw. So you will have basically a 1 octave increase in pitch, and somewhere around here it will sound like there's an octave chord, like you're actually playing 2 notes. The width parameters are, while you're keeping the shape in this position, are apparently useless. But at least the first one. The second seems just as useless if the first is here. If you move this one somewhere else, things will start making sense. This happens only if you are keeping this shape here, because if you keep it somewhere else, both widths control do things and actually work on 1 cycle or actually 2 cycles, which is an interesting addition to, classic pulse width modulation. And then there is this one, which is Submix, which allows you to add or actually substitute the whole oscillator with another square wave, which is 1 octave below the fundamental. And then there is the sync, which is self-explanatory, and the Unison Modes, which it's not about modes, the Unison voices and the Unison detune. A bunch of these have, beyond this, they have other parameters. Here you can control it from being an absolute to being a relative detuning, like it is in this case, or absolute detuning if you want the detune to be not sensitive to what note you're playing and be the same amount of detuning in a logarithmic scale. Anyway, so this said, we're gonna actually not in a logarithmic scale, because that would make it relative. Anyway, this said, I'm gonna use for making this pad somehow the oldest trick in the book, which is pulse width modulation. And wanting to make a pad which sounds a little bit bigger, I'm going to use more than 1 oscillator, say 2 for starters, and then maybe 3. Let me just turn this one back off again. So the idea about pulse width modulation is making this kind of a square wave. Let's say how classic we want, in a classic, most classic synths, you couldn't have this mixture of waveforms from 1 single oscillator. And then I'm going to use LFOs to modulate the widths. So say, for example, I'm getting this somewhere right here, and I'm going to lower the rate of this LFO, and then click again so that it becomes blue. And once it's blue, I can turn it into a modulation. I can right-click to change how it works. I can do a lot of things, add add or remove things from how modulations are working in this case. So then I'm going to get another LFO. I mean, it's not strictly necessary. Yeah, one would be enough, and lower the frequency of this one as well, but put it to a different value from this one. So they are slightly different, but different enough so that it will not sound like a single modulation, and modulate with 2 with this. Now we're going to be hearing only one oscillator, and this might be, doesn't sound even remotely like something reminding of a pad because it's one. The Unison would be the most obvious choice for making things a little bit thicker. But another thing you can do is just, supposing we are like pretending to be like in the 80s before this wonderful era we're living in where you can have per oscillator unison. I'm going to do this and just give this one just a similar amount of detuning. I don't remember how much was that originally here. -7. I'm going to put this one to +7 so that it is slightly around the center. And here too, I might use the same 2 LFOs, or I might use some other LFO and maybe, I don't know, change this width and make them different. It will be, in volume, it will be perfectly in the center, but it will sound slightly different from the right channel to the left channel. I'm going to use LFO3 as well and get this to quite slow and then set it to control width 2. Now this you're not hearing it because I haven't unmuted it. So we have this thing. Oh, actually, as I was talking about it being stereo open, it isn't, because of course these two are perfectly mono at the moment. And then I'm saying, let's get this a little bit lower too. I want a little bit more of squarishness anyway. So we have this thing which is doing all this changes and stuff. And what else? I'm going to use Oscillator 3 as well. Oscillator 3 will not have any of these modulations and will just be set to be, I could do it lowering the octave and making it a square wave, but I just push the submix to the max. So we have this sound which is big and buzzy. If we want it to sound a little less buzzy, we could just change the engine to warm, because if we're trying to make something analog-ish, it's probably a good idea. So let's add the filter. I already mentioned I'm going to use this one, which is the OBX 12 dB. And filters have here a hidden parameter. You can go for the standard version, in the case of this one, to the pushed version, which according to the manual, which I strongly advise reading. I mean, there is a manual, you should read one. Read it. It gives a different, more nonlinear response for higher values of the resonance. But we're not going to do anything about the resonance for now. I'll add a bit of keyboard tracking, just, I don't know, a bit, because I like there to be a little bit of keyboard tracking. And here we go to set up our filter. See? This is, a little bit too fast, right? So we might want our amp envelope to be a bit slower, to have it start slower. I mean, I've been discussing this stuff already while talking about making pads in Vital. The whole process is identical. The interface is different, so let's talk about it. That's basically it, but I strongly recommend go check out my previous videos about it, because it's mostly the same identical process. I made these a little bit slower. Let's open it up a bit and add some sustain, because I want it to open, but I don't want it to completely close again. But I'll set it to be... This decay is definitely too short. We want a long decay. And even longer attack. And the release is set to 0 or almost 0. So anytime I raise my fingers from it, it just dies, which isn't good for a pad. Now it's a little better. Now, we might say it's done because we're close to it, but there is a wonderful parameter we can add here, which is this Oscillator Drift. What does this do? It adds drift. It makes the tuning of the oscillators go randomly up and down, not as consistent as you would expect out of a digital synth. This is another thing which helps in emulating some analog behavior. If you wanted to do the same thing in Vital, as I did in a few videos, you'd need to use a random generator. This one here adds you a practical slider, no control about how this oscillator drift goes, about its frequency, its behavior. You can just control the amount of it, but it's, well, already quite useful, and it seems to do its job pretty nicely. You could want to add a bunch of things. You could add some resonance, not too much because it would turn into a whistle, but a little bit of it kind of enriches it nicely. I think it's kind of nice. You can appreciate it. I mean, at least I do. Now, this is all as far as synth goes, but as history tells us, there's more. There's more because, well, first of all, I actually have the possibility of using Unison. So I could do 3 voices of Unison on one and say 2 on the other, and maybe check out my detuning in a way that I like, so that like this one has this amount of detuning, and let's say Oscillator 2 will be more detuned. Yep, I got slightly clipping, but because this thing, you sum a bunch of voices and the volume raises a lot, but it seems to sound in the way I meant to. So now we have Unison, so somehow using chorus would be redundant, but it's still a good idea. As some say, there is the best friend of an analog synth tone is a chorus, and so let's use chorus. Like there's this fat or fullness. There's a bunch of, all these effect algorithms come with a bunch of presets which somehow send you already, I don't know, close to what you're looking for. Just check out the names and see. Yeah, it kind of works. Then what else? If we were in the olden days, reverb was very expensive, unusual, but it still sounds great on a sound like this. So we'll also add some reverb. And there's Reverb 1, which is apparently an older algorithm, less CPU intensive, but also not as good sounding. And this Reverb 2. So I'm gonna get one Reverb 2. I'm gonna go for this Cathedral 2, and then see here I have the mix. I'm gonna turn it to the max. There are some presets of the reverb which are intended to be put in Ascend, and some others which aren't. The way to turn a preset which you don't want to, which wasn't intended to be in Ascend, to one which works in Ascend is just, putting it to the mix to 100%. And so let's send some signal to it. Huge, lots of it. I'm gonna put some low frequency damping because it kind of helps lower this high frequency damp. Actually, I wanted to do the opposite. It's already fine. I mean, I already have high frequency damping to the max. I'm just gonna reduce it a little bit and lower. And probably a little bit of pre-delay would help too, maybe a little more. It's big, it's mighty stereo, it's working. I mean, at least I like it. Then say this sounds a little bit too nice, but we want it to sound more analog, more real. We already have put the Oscillator Drift, but we're still, our whole signal chain is probably a little bit too pristine. We might add some wave shaping here, we might add some feedback to the filters, which are all interesting solutions, or we could keep doing it with effects. So here with effects we have a possibility of using this tape. Tape is actually quite nice. It emulates a tape distortion, what you would expect. So saying, the buried message is probably a little bit too bad. It's really mystery. Let's go for analog. We're trying to make it sound analog, so why not? Let's reduce the mix because to 100% is a little too much. this sounds a little worse, which is exactly what we wanted. I mean, at least what I wanted. I don't know what you wanted, but I wanted it to sound worse, interestingly worse. And I think it does. It sounds like it has been treated. It has a little bit more of a lo-fi vibe, and I think it's a good add-on to the thing itself. Now, getting rid of this tape for the moment, because I mean, I do not necessarily need it, and going a little bit away from the purely analog emulation, or actually still in that department anyway. There's a lot of other effects which have been classically used on pads. There's phasers, which, as you probably know, there's been countless pads which add big phasers on. Whoa, 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 what is happening? It's too high, the volume goes crazy. Because there's these peaks which are a little bit too... Let's reduce the feedback a bit, but increase the number of stages. Actually decreasing it increased it, because of course the zero is right here. We can do a lot of things about it, make it happen lower in frequency, and it's still quite an interesting effect to add on your pad. Another thing you could do is use a flanger, which is, you know, a close relative to a chorus, but to go do something even more interesting in my view, as I showed again in the video about pads, you could use a comb filter. Here we have comb plus and comb minus. I'm going to use a comb plus. I'm going to put not the filter envelope, but I'm going to put the key tracking to the max so that it will be tuned somehow, even though not exactly in tune, to our note. Let's give it a generous amount of resonance. And find a frequency where you like it, where you seem to be in an interesting combination with your sound. Then you could, because it actually works as typically is done with flangers, you could also animate it a bit, like change the cutoff with one LFO, or maybe even with two LFOs in different directions and different amounts. So it's moving around, and maybe even go as far as deciding that you want one of these LFOs to have its frequency controlled by the key tracking, which will also have an effect, since we're using this also for pulse width modulation on one of our oscillators, which will make things a lot different when you move around the keyboard and make your sound more varied. There's probably too much resonance, a little less. This comb effect is a little too prominent for my taste. Yeah, kind of works. I think it does. I mean, I hope you think so too. So, well, this was it, and I suppose we've covered a few things about the interface and the components of the synth, and I hope you learned something interesting from it. And this is it for now, for this video at least. I'm going to talk more about Surge in the future, and I'm going to make more sounds with it, and I'm going to make more patches and explain you how to use other components of it. I'm not necessarily going to abandon Vital, especially if you show some interest. If you want me to do something specific, some specific type of sound, and you want me to do that on one or some other synth, well, down here, there's a comment section. You just ask, and as time has proven, I do answer comments and do what I'm told, though you wouldn't expect me to be that obedient. If no one tells me anything about it, anyway, my next video is probably going to be about audio rate modulations in Odin 2 because I found it very, very interesting. It can be another very wild FM synth for, and not only FM, you know, FM, RM, you can do filter FM, you can do lots and lots of crazy stuff with audio rate modulations in that synth, and I think it's worth covering. And if about Surge, my next video is probably going to be about FM because it has surprisingly nice FM capabilities. I don't know why they're so surprising, but I mean, making a FM pianoid like the one you're hearing right now is surprisingly easy, and you make it sound surprisingly effective and playable. I mean, I really found myself enjoying it a lot. I mean, if I had hair, now it would be this big. I mean, I would have been drawn back to the 80s in no time. This said, thanks again for your attention, and bye. Check out the links in the description. There's a bunch of patches for Vital in my Gumroad, and there's soon going to be patches about Surge and other synths too. There's some links to my music if you if you fancy hearing what I do with my amazing sound design skills. And there's also a link to the page of Hashkey, who's the guy who's made my thumbnails, and he also has a nice Twitch channel on which he streams regularly, saying a lot of things about DAW synths mixing, and he is, is quite responsive and nice, and I totally recommend checking it out. And there is, of course, as in the beginning, there is Deeptanzproductions, which I'm working with, and we offer a bunch of audio-related services. And if you are interested in any of that, again, there's a link. Click it and let us know. All this said, thanks again for the attention, and bye.